3,000 years ago, an Egyptian scribe dipped a reed pen into black ink and carefully drew a series of symbols onto a sheet of papyrus. To him, the marks were perfectly clear. Each sign carried meaning. Each word belonged to a language spoken throughout one of the most powerful civilizations in human history. The text was not meant to be mysterious. It was not written as a puzzle. It was simply a record, a message intended for people living in the same world. But then something unexpected happened. Centuries passed, kingdoms collapsed, languages changed, entire civilizations disappeared, and gradually, the ability to read these symbols vanished. The writings remained. The meaning did not. For nearly 1,500 years, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs became one of history's greatest unsolved puzzles. Travelers stared at temple walls covered with inscriptions. Explorers copied symbols from monuments and tombs. Scholars debated endlessly about their purpose. Some believed the signs represented secret wisdom. Others thought they were purely symbolic images. No one truly understood what the ancient Egyptians had been trying to say. Then everything changed. A single stone discovered by chance during a military campaign opened a door into a forgotten world. Suddenly, texts that had been silent for centuries began to speak again. Royal decrees, medical knowledge, historical records, personal stories, accounts of war, accounts of famine, accounts of triumph, accounts of uncertainty. The ancient Egyptians had left behind far more than monuments. They had left behind an entire system for organizing reality itself. Tonight, we are not simply exploring hieroglyphs. We are exploring the extraordinary way Egypt transformed memory into stone, knowledge into writing, and chaos into order. Because when researchers finally decoded these texts, they discovered something surprising. The hieroglyphs were not merely recording history, they were helping create it. And the story begins with one of the most important discoveries in the history of archaeology, a discovery that transformed silent symbols into a readable language once again. The stone that gave ancient Egypt its voice back in 1799, a group of French soldiers working near the Egyptian town of Rosetta noticed something unusual. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary fragment of dark stone, damaged, broken, incomplete, certainly old, but hardly impressive compared to the enormous temples and pyramids scattered across Egypt. Yet this damaged stone would eventually become one of the most important archaeological discoveries ever made, because hidden on its surface was a solution to a mystery that had frustrated scholars for centuries. The artifact would become known as the Rosetta Stone. And in many ways, it changed humanity's relationship with the ancient world. To understand why, we need to imagine a world where Egyptian hieroglyphs could no longer be read. Today, we take written language for granted. Books, signs, documents, messages. We move through a world filled with text. Ancient Egypt was no different. Writing appeared everywhere. Temple walls, royal monuments, tombs, administrative records, religious texts, statues, papyrus scrolls. The civilization recorded enormous amounts of information. Yet after the decline of ancient Egyptian culture, knowledge of the language gradually disappeared. The final generations capable of reading hieroglyphs eventually passed away. No teachers remained. No schools preserved the system. The chain of knowledge broke. And once it was broken, the inscriptions became silent. For more than 1,000 years, people could see the symbols but could not understand them. Imagine discovering a library filled with books written in an unknown script. You could recognize patterns. You could identify repeated symbols. You might even guess at certain meanings. But the actual message would remain hidden. That was the situation scholars faced when studying Egypt. The monuments survived. The language did not. As interest in ancient Egypt grew throughout Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, many attempts were made to solve the problem. Researchers carefully copied inscriptions. They compared symbols. They proposed theories. Some believed hieroglyphs functioned entirely as symbolic images. Others suspected the signs represented sounds. The debate continued without resolution. Then came the discovery at Rosetta. The stone itself was not especially large, nor was it perfectly preserved. A significant portion had already been broken away, yet what remained contained something remarkable. The same text appeared 3 separate times. At the bottom was ancient Greek. Above it was Demotic, a later Egyptian script used in daily administration. At the top were hieroglyphs. This arrangement transformed the stone into an intellectual bridge between worlds. Unlike hieroglyphs, ancient Greek could still be read. Scholars immediately recognized this fact. If the Greek text matched the other inscriptions, then perhaps the unknown scripts could finally be deciphered. The challenge was enormous. Having a translation key does not automatically solve a language. Researchers still needed to determine how the Egyptian writing system worked. Were symbols representing sounds, words, ideas, entire concepts? Years passed. Attempts were made. Progress remained slow. Then, a young French scholar named Jean-François Champollion began approaching the problem differently. Instead of treating hieroglyphs as purely symbolic images, he considered the possibility that at least some signs represented sounds. This idea was not entirely new. Others had suggested it before, but Champollion pursued the concept with exceptional determination. He studied ancient languages extensively. He compared inscriptions carefully. Most importantly, he focused on royal names. Researchers had noticed that certain groups of hieroglyphs appeared enclosed within oval shapes known today as cartouches. These often surrounded the names of kings and queens. Because some royal names were already known from Greek sources, they provided valuable clues. If a cartouche corresponded to a known ruler, perhaps individual symbols could be matched with specific sounds. Gradually, patterns emerged. A breakthrough occurred, then another, and another. The system began revealing its logic. Hieroglyphs were neither purely symbolic nor purely phonetic. They combined multiple functions. Some signs represented sounds. Others represented ideas. Still others provided additional clarification. The writing system was far more sophisticated than many scholars had imagined. Suddenly, inscriptions that had remained silent for centuries became readable. The effect was revolutionary. Imagine discovering that thousands of locked doors could suddenly be opened. Every temple wall, every monument, every inscription, every preserved document, all became potential sources of information. Ancient Egypt was no longer known only through archaeology and later historical accounts. Now Egyptians could speak for themselves through their own words. The impact extended far beyond language. Decipherment transformed the entire field of Egyptology. Researchers could identify rulers more accurately, establish historical timelines, understand religious practices, study administration, examine economic systems, investigate literature. The civilization became dramatically more accessible. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the Rosetta Stone is what it reveals about Egyptian society itself. The inscription was not created to help future archaeologists. It served a practical purpose in its own time. The text records a decree issued during the reign of Ptolemy V. Officials wanted the message understood by different audiences. That is why it appeared in multiple scripts. What was once an administrative decision eventually became the key to recovering an entire lost language. History often works in unexpected ways. The stone survived because it happened to be reused in later construction. It was discovered because soldiers happened to notice it. It became famous because scholars recognized its significance. Each step depended upon circumstances no one could have predicted, and yet the result was extraordinary. The Rosetta Stone did more than decode hieroglyphs. It restored a conversation interrupted for over a millennium. For the first time in centuries, ancient Egyptians could once again tell their own stories. Stories about kings, about temples, about wars, about beliefs, about everyday life. But as researchers continued reading these recovered texts, they noticed something intriguing. Many inscriptions were not simply describing events, they were organizing them, shaping them, transforming complex realities into structured records. And nowhere was that more evident than in Egypt's efforts to record something every civilization struggles to preserve. Its own history, the king list that tried to organize time. Once scholars learned how to read ancient Egyptian texts again, a remarkable pattern began to emerge. The Egyptians were obsessed with order, not simply order in the sense of neat buildings or efficient administration. They sought order in something much more difficult to control: time itself. Every civilization faces the same challenge. People are born. Leaders rise to power. Governments change. Generations pass away. Memories fade. Over centuries, the past becomes increasingly difficult to organize. What happened first? Who ruled when? Which events mattered most? How should they be remembered? Ancient Egypt confronted these questions thousands of years ago, and their solution was surprisingly ambitious. They attempted to transform the entire history of their civilization into a structured system that could be preserved and inherited. One of the most fascinating examples of this effort survives today in fragments of a document known as the Turin Royal Canon. At first glance, it appears unimpressive. Unlike the Rosetta Stone, it is not carved into durable rock. Unlike the pyramids, it is not monumental. The artifact survives only in pieces, small fragments of ancient papyrus that had to be painstakingly reconstructed by researchers. Yet despite its damaged condition, the Turin Royal Canon remains one of the most important historical documents ever discovered from ancient Egypt, because it reveals how Egyptians thought about history itself. Imagine attempting to create a complete list of every national leader who had governed your country over thousands of years. Now imagine doing so without modern databases, archives, or digital records. The task would be enormous. That is essentially what Egyptian scribes attempted. The Turin Royal Canon appears to have recorded rulers stretching back through vast periods of Egyptian history. Names, lengths of reigns, dynastic sequences, historical relationships. The document functioned almost like an ancient database, a carefully organized effort to structure the past. To modern historians, this is incredibly valuable. The document helps researchers reconstruct chronology. It provides clues about succession. It preserves names that might otherwise have disappeared entirely. Yet the text also raises an interesting question. Why were the Egyptians investing so much effort in recording rulers? The answer goes far beyond simple curiosity. For ancient Egypt, political stability depended heavily upon continuity. Each pharaoh was not viewed merely as a temporary political leader. The king occupied a unique position within Egyptian society. He served as a link between the human world and the divine order that Egyptians believed governed existence. As a result, preserving royal succession carried enormous significance. History was not merely a record of the past, it was evidence that order continued, that legitimacy continued, that society remained connected to its foundations. In this sense, king lists performed an important cultural function. They organized memory. And organizing memory was one of Egypt's greatest achievements. Modern societies often preserve information through countless institutions: libraries, archives, universities, government databases. Ancient Egypt relied heavily upon scribes. These individuals occupied a highly respected position within society. Their responsibilities extended far beyond simple writing. Scribes collected information, managed records, tracked resources, maintained administrative systems, and preserved cultural knowledge. Without them, Egypt's enormous bureaucracy would have struggled to function. The Turin Royal Canon demonstrates just how sophisticated that record-keeping could become. Creating such a document required access to earlier records, knowledge of dynasties, awareness of historical traditions, and a system capable of preserving information across centuries. The document therefore tells us something important about Egypt itself. This was not a civilization living only in the present. It actively studied its own past. And that interest in history created both opportunities and challenges. Because once people begin recording history, another question inevitably appears. What should be included? And perhaps more importantly, what should be left out? This issue becomes increasingly visible throughout Egyptian historical records. Not every ruler received equal treatment. Not every reign was remembered in the same way. Certain individuals were celebrated, others were minimized. Some disappeared from official narratives almost entirely. Modern historians encounter similar issues when studying any historical source. documents are never perfectly neutral. The people creating them make choices. They decide which events deserve attention, which individuals matter, which stories will be preserved for future generations. The Turin royal canon reflects this reality. Although enormously valuable, it was still a product of human decision-making. It organized history according to specific priorities, and that observation reveals something fascinating about ancient Egypt. The civilization was not simply preserving memory, it was curating memory. There is a difference. Preservation attempts to save information. Curation organizes information into meaningful patterns. Egyptian scribes excelled at both. Consider the challenge they faced. Egyptian civilization lasted for thousands of years, far longer than many ancient states. Over that immense span of time, rulers came and went, political centers shifted, religious practices evolved, external threats appeared, internal reforms occurred. The amount of information generated was staggering. Without systems for organization, historical memory could easily become fragmented. The king lists helped prevent that fragmentation. They imposed structure, created continuity, and allowed later generations to understand their place within a much longer story. This concern with continuity appears throughout Egyptian culture. Monuments emphasized dynastic succession. Temples preserved ritual traditions. Administrative documents tracked resources across generations. Everything reflected a desire to maintain stability. And perhaps nowhere is that desire more evident than in the treatment of kingship. For Egyptians, the king represented more than an individual. He represented the ongoing survival of order itself. Recording royal succession therefore became an act of cultural preservation. The Turin royal canon was not simply documenting rulers, it was documenting continuity. The remarkable thing is that this effort still influences modern understanding today. Historians frequently rely upon surviving king lists when reconstructing Egyptian chronology. Without such records, many aspects of ancient history would remain far more difficult to understand. The document therefore performs a dual role. It tells us about ancient rulers, but it also tells us about the people who created the list, their priorities, their values, their understanding of history, and perhaps most importantly, their belief that the past could be organized. That belief may seem obvious to us, yet it represented a significant intellectual achievement. History is messy. Events overlap, memories conflict, interpretations change. Creating a coherent narrative requires effort. Egyptian scribes dedicated enormous resources to that task. They believed knowledge should be preserved in a form future generations could inherit. In many ways, that goal remains familiar today. Modern historians continue doing something similar, gathering evidence, organizing information, reconstructing chronology, attempting to understand the relationship between past and present. The tools have changed. The challenge remains remarkably similar, yet despite their commitment to historical order, Egyptian records reveal something unexpected. The past was not always preserved exactly as it happened. Sometimes history became intertwined with politics, sometimes memory served power. And sometimes inscriptions were designed not merely to record events, but to shape public perception. This becomes especially clear when we examine one of the most famous monuments in Egypt. A monument standing beside the Great Sphinx, a monument that tells a story about destiny, kingship, and divine approval. A story carefully carved into stone for future generations to read, and perhaps to believe. The dream that became a kingdom, if the Turin royal canon shows how ancient Egyptians organized the past. Another remarkable monument reveals how they sometimes shaped the future. Because not every inscription was designed simply to record information. Some were designed to persuade, some were designed to inspire, and some were designed to strengthen a ruler's claim to power. One of the most fascinating examples stands in the shadow of one of the most famous monuments on Earth, the Great Sphinx of Giza. For thousands of years, the Sphinx has watched over the Egyptian desert. Its enormous body stretches across the plateau. Its face looks toward the rising sun. And despite centuries of study, it remains one of the most recognizable symbols of ancient Egypt. But hidden between its massive paws stands a monument that often receives far less attention. A carved slab of stone known today as the Dream Stela. At first glance, it appears to be just another inscription. another example of Egyptian writing carved into stone. Yet once scholars deciphered its hieroglyphs, they discovered something far more interesting. The inscription tells a story about a young prince, a dream, and a promise that would eventually lead to a throne. Whether every detail should be interpreted literally is a question historians continue discussing. But regardless of how the story is understood, the monument provides extraordinary insight into how Egyptians used writing to connect kingship, religion, and legitimacy. The story begins with a man who was not yet king. His name was Thutmose. Today he is known as Thutmose IV. But according to the inscription, the events described occurred before he became pharaoh. At the time, he was still a prince. One day, while hunting near Giza, he stopped to rest beside the Great Sphinx. The monument was already ancient, even by Egyptian standards. Centuries of wind-blown sand had partially buried much of its body. Only portions remained visible above the desert surface. As the story goes, the prince fell asleep in the shadow of the giant monument. Then he dreamed. In this dream, the Sphinx spoke. It addressed the young prince directly. According to the inscription, the monument promised him something extraordinary. If he cleared away the sand surrounding the Sphinx and restored the sacred monument, he would receive divine favor and eventually become king. It is a dramatic story, a mysterious dream, a divine message, a future ruler receiving a promise from one of Egypt's most sacred monuments. For ancient audiences, the narrative would have been powerful. The story linked kingship with divine approval. It suggested that the future pharaoh had been chosen, not merely by human institutions, but by sacred forces connected to Egypt's spiritual order. Modern historians approach the inscription carefully. The goal is not to determine whether the dream literally occurred. That question belongs to a different category of inquiry. Instead, researchers ask something equally interesting. Why was this story carved into stone? What purpose did it serve? The answer reveals much about Egyptian political culture. Throughout history, rulers have often sought ways to demonstrate legitimacy. Some point to family connections. Others emphasize military success. Still others appeal to religion, tradition, or law. Ancient Egypt was no different. The dream stela appears to strengthen the relationship between kingship and divine approval. By presenting Thutmose as someone chosen through a sacred encounter, the inscription reinforces his position as ruler. In other words, the monument functions on multiple levels simultaneously. It is a narrative, a religious statement, a political message, and a historical record, all at the same time. This blending of purposes appears repeatedly throughout Egyptian writing. The Egyptians rarely separated categories in the way modern societies often do. Religion influenced politics. Politics influenced history. History influenced cultural identity. The boundaries were interconnected. The dream stela demonstrates this beautifully. To understand why such inscriptions mattered, we need to appreciate the importance of kingship within Egyptian society. The pharaoh occupied a unique position. He was not simply an administrator, nor merely a military leader. The king was expected to maintain what Egyptians called ma'at, a concept that combined ideas of balance, order, justice, and harmony. Maintaining ma'at meant preserving stability throughout the kingdom, ensuring prosperity, supporting religious traditions, protecting society from disorder. This responsibility gave kingship enormous symbolic significance. The ruler represented continuity itself. Therefore, any narrative that strengthened royal legitimacy also strengthened confidence in the broader social order. The dream stela contributes directly to this process. It presents kingship not as an accident, not as a matter of chance, but as something connected to a larger cosmic framework. The story communicates a simple but powerful idea. The ruler belongs on the throne because divine forces support his position. What makes the inscription particularly fascinating is how effectively it combines storytelling with political communication. The text does not present a dry administrative statement. It tells a memorable narrative. There is a setting, a character, a dream, a promise, a transformation. The structure resembles storytelling techniques that remain familiar even today. Humans naturally respond to stories. We remember them more easily than lists of facts. Ancient Egyptian scribes understood this. By embedding political ideas within narrative form, they increased the likelihood that the message would endure. And endure it did. Thousands of years later, scholars continue studying the inscription. Not because it provides definitive answers about succession politics, but because it reveals how Egyptians thought about authority. The monument shows us that writing could do more than preserve information. It could shape perception, it could influence memory, it could connect rulers with larger cultural values. The Dream Stela also highlights another important aspect of Egyptian civilization: its extraordinary confidence in permanence. The inscription was carved into stone, placed beside one of the most enduring monuments ever constructed. The creators clearly expected the message to survive. And remarkably, it has. Imagine the effort required. Crafting the text. Preparing the monument. Carving each hieroglyph carefully into stone. The project required resources, labor, and planning. Such investments make sense only if people believe the message matters. The Egyptians believed it did. Because written records served as more than communication. They served as preservation, a way to carry ideas beyond the lifespan of individuals. This broader theme appears repeatedly throughout Egyptian history. Again and again, we encounter attempts to transform temporary events into permanent records. Victories became inscriptions. Religious beliefs became temple texts. Administrative decisions became official documents. Narratives became monuments. The goal was not merely to remember. The goal was to stabilize memory, to make it durable, predictable, transferable. The Dream Stela is one example among many, yet it illustrates something fundamental about the civilization that created it. Ancient Egypt trusted writing, trusted monuments, trusted records. These tools allowed people to impose structure upon an uncertain world, and uncertainty was never far away. Harvests could fail, political conditions could change, external threats could emerge, human life remained unpredictable. Writing offered a way to create continuity amid that uncertainty. The story carved between the paws of the Sphinx therefore represents more than a royal dream. It represents a broader Egyptian strategy. Transform experience into narrative. Transform narrative into memory. Transform memory into stability. As scholars continued deciphering Egyptian texts, they found this pattern everywhere, in temples, in papyrus archives, and especially in some of the largest administrative records ever produced in the ancient world. Documents so extensive that they preserved not only stories and beliefs, but entire inventories of resources, donations, labor, and wealth. Records that reveal how Egypt managed the practical realities of sustaining one of history's most enduring civilizations. The papyrus that recorded an entire kingdom. When people think about ancient Egypt, they often imagine pyramids, golden treasures, monumental statues, great temples rising from the desert. Yet civilizations are not sustained by monuments alone. Behind every pyramid stood workers. Behind every temple stood administrators. Behind every successful kingdom stood systems capable of managing enormous amounts of information. Food had to be distributed, resources had to be tracked, labor had to be organized. Religious institutions had to be supported, taxes had to be collected, records had to be maintained. Without administration, even the most powerful civilization would struggle to survive. Ancient Egypt understood this reality remarkably well, and few surviving documents illustrate that better than the Great Harris Papyrus. At nearly 40 meters in length, it is one of the longest papyrus documents ever discovered from ancient Egypt. To modern readers, the document can initially seem overwhelming. Line after line of text, lists, inventories, donations, descriptions of projects, records of resources. At first glance, it may appear less exciting than stories of kings and battles, yet historians regard it as one of the most valuable documents ever recovered, because it provides something surprisingly rare, a detailed glimpse into how an ancient civilization actually functioned. The Great Harris Papyrus dates to the reign of Ramses III and the period immediately following his rule. By this point, Egypt had already existed for more than 2,000 years. The kingdom possessed extensive administrative traditions. Generations of scribes had developed methods for recording information, managing institutions, and preserving state memory. The papyrus reflects the maturity of those systems. It is not merely a list of facts, it is a carefully organized portrait of a kingdom. Imagine being responsible for documenting the activities of an entire nation. The task would be enormous: agricultural production, religious donations, construction projects, personnel, land holdings, economic resources. Every category generates information. Every piece of information must be recorded accurately. The Great Harris Papyrus reveals just how seriously Egyptians approached that challenge. The document records vast quantities of resources provided to temples throughout Egypt: gold, silver, livestock, grain, land, workers, offerings. The scale is impressive. Yet the most interesting aspect may not be the quantities themselves. It is the fact that someone considered them worth recording. The Egyptians believed information mattered, and they believed preserving information mattered even more. This attitude appears throughout Egyptian civilization. Again and again, we encounter efforts to transform complex realities into structured records. The Great Harris Papyrus represents one of the clearest examples. The kingdom generated enormous amounts of activity. The document organizes that activity into categories people could understand. Resources become inventories, events become records, administration becomes memory. Modern governments perform similar functions: budgets, reports, statistical summaries, administrative databases. These systems allow large societies to manage complexity. Ancient Egypt lacked digital technology, yet the underlying challenge remained the same. How do you organize enough information to govern effectively? The answer was bureaucracy. Today, the word bureaucracy sometimes carries negative associations: endless paperwork, complicated procedures, administrative delays. But in historical terms, bureaucracy often represents a major achievement. It allows societies to coordinate large populations, manage resources, preserve institutional knowledge, and maintain continuity across generations. Egypt's bureaucracy was among the most successful in the ancient world. The Great Harris Papyrus demonstrates why. The document reveals an extraordinary attention to detail. Scribes carefully tracked donations, recorded distributions, documented responsibilities, maintained records capable of surviving beyond the lives of individual officials. This continuity mattered enormously. A kingdom lasting thousands of years cannot depend solely upon personal memory. Knowledge must become institutional. The papyrus helped accomplish that goal. Yet there is another layer to the document, one that makes it especially interesting. The text does not merely record economic information. It also communicates ideas about kingship, authority, and legitimacy. This combination appears frequently in Egyptian writing. Practical administration and ideology often worked together. The papyrus highlights the generosity and accomplishments of Ramses III. It emphasizes his contributions to religious institutions, his support for temples, his role as protector and provider. These themes serve an important function. They reinforce the image of an effective ruler, a king fulfilling his responsibilities, a leader maintaining order. In other words, the document is both an administrative record and a political statement. To modern readers, this may seem surprising. We often separate categories. Economic reports belong in one place, political messages belong somewhere else. Ancient Egypt frequently blended them. The same document could perform multiple functions simultaneously. It could preserve information while also shaping perception. This dual purpose makes the Great Harris Papyrus particularly valuable. Historians can study economic conditions, administrative structures, religious institutions, and political messaging within a single source. Few documents offer such broad insight. The papyrus also reminds us that civilizations depend upon ordinary systems. Monuments capture attention. Administration sustains societies. Without reliable food distribution, monumental construction becomes impossible. Without record-keeping, resources disappear into confusion. Without organization, large populations become difficult to coordinate. The Great Harris Papyrus reveals the invisible foundation supporting visible achievements. It shows the machinery behind the monument. And that machinery was impressive. Consider the logistics involved. Egypt stretched across hundreds of miles of Nile Valley. Temples operated throughout the kingdom. Agricultural production fluctuated seasonally. Resources moved constantly. Tracking this activity required skilled personnel and standardized procedures. The papyrus reflects a world where information flowed through administrative networks, a world where scribes transformed reality into records. This process may sound mundane, yet it represents one of history's most important innovations. Large-scale information management changed what societies could accomplish. The ability to record, organize, and retrieve knowledge expanded human capabilities dramatically. Ancient Egypt became exceptionally skilled at this task, and because the climate preserved many documents, modern researchers can still observe the results. The Great Harris Papyrus also highlights another recurring theme in Egyptian civilization: the relationship between permanence and uncertainty. Human life is unpredictable. Harvests vary. Political conditions change. Natural events disrupt expectations. Writing offered a response to that uncertainty. Records created stability. Information preserved continuity. Documentation reduced confusion. The Egyptians repeatedly used writing to transform temporary events into lasting knowledge. This strategy appears throughout the civilization's history: administrative records, religious texts, historical inscriptions, medical documents, literary works. Each contributes to a broader effort: the effort to preserve order, to make experience manageable, to ensure that important knowledge survives. The Great Harris Papyrus embodies this ambition beautifully. It captures a kingdom attempting to understand itself, a civilization recording its resources, its institutions, its priorities, and its accomplishments. But administration was only one side of the story. Egyptian rulers also used writing for another purpose. They used it to communicate power, to transform military campaigns into lasting narratives, to present victory as evidence of divine favor and royal effectiveness. Some of the most famous monuments in Egypt were created not simply to record events, but to shape how those events would be remembered, and few examples illustrate this process more clearly than a monument erected by a pharaoh named Merneptah, a monument whose inscription still attracts attention more than 3,000 years after it was carved, because it demonstrates how ancient Egypt turned conflict into history, and history into memory. The monument that turned victory into memory history is rarely just a collection of events. It is also a collection of stories. Stories about what happened, stories about why it happened, and perhaps most importantly, stories about how people chose to remember it. Ancient Egypt understood this remarkably well. Its rulers did not simply experience events. They recorded them, interpreted them, and often transformed them into narratives designed to endure long after the original participants were gone. One of the clearest examples survives on a monument known today as the Victory Stela of Merneptah. At first glance, the monument appears familiar: a large stone slab covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions. Ancient Egypt produced many such monuments. Yet this particular stela occupies a unique place in history, because it reveals how Egyptians used writing to convert military success into cultural memory, and in doing so, it demonstrates the extraordinary power of written records. The monument dates to the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah, who ruled during the late 13th century BCE. By this time, Egypt had already enjoyed centuries of imperial influence. Its rulers governed a complex kingdom supported by sophisticated administrative systems, powerful religious institutions, and long-standing traditions of record-keeping. Writing played a central role within that system. Important events were not left to memory alone. They were documented, preserved, and carefully presented. The Victory Stela belongs to this broader tradition. Its inscription describes military campaigns and celebrates the achievements of the king. For modern historians, the monument serves several functions simultaneously. It provides historical information, it offers insight into political ideology, and it reveals how ancient Egyptians thought about power. The text presents Merneptah as a successful ruler, a defender of Egypt, a king capable of overcoming threats and restoring order. This message would have been familiar to Egyptian audiences. Throughout Egyptian history, rulers frequently emphasized their role as protectors of stability. The concept appears again and again: order versus disorder, security versus chaos, civilization versus threat. These themes formed an important part of royal identity. The king was expected to preserve balance. Military success therefore carried significance beyond the battlefield. Victories reinforced confidence in the ruler's ability to maintain the proper functioning of society. The stela communicates this idea clearly. Yet what makes the monument especially interesting is not simply what it records. It is how the information is presented. Modern readers often approach historical documents expecting objective descriptions. Ancient inscriptions serve different purposes. The goal was not necessarily to provide a neutral account. The goal was to communicate meaning, to reinforce legitimacy, to celebrate achievement, to shape collective memory. This distinction is important. The victory stela does not function like a modern newspaper article. It functions more like a carefully crafted public statement. Its creators selected information, organized it, and presented it in ways designed to convey specific messages. This practice was not unique to Egypt. Civilizations throughout history have used monuments to celebrate important events. Ancient Rome did it. Medieval kingdoms did it. Modern nations continue doing it today. Monuments help societies remember, but they also help societies interpret. They influence how events are understood. The Victory Stela illustrates this process beautifully. The monument transforms military activity into narrative. A campaign becomes a story into Bazanal. Dabai Dagnan's memory becomes part of cultural identity. For historians, this creates both opportunities and challenges. The opportunity is obvious. The inscription preserves information that might otherwise have disappeared entirely. Without such records, many details about Egypt's history would be lost. The challenge involves interpretation. Researchers must consider not only what the text says, but also why it says it. What audience was being addressed? What message was being emphasized? What broader goals did the monument serve? These questions help scholars understand the document more fully. The answers often reveal as much about Egyptian society as they do about individual events. One particularly fascinating aspect of the Victory Stela is how it connects earthly events with divine approval. This connection appears frequently throughout Egyptian writing. Success was rarely portrayed as random. Victories were often linked to the proper relationship between the king and the gods. The rulers succeeded because order prevailed, because divine support existed, because the kingdom functioned as intended. This perspective reflects a worldview very different from many modern assumptions. Ancient Egyptians tended to view political stability, religious practice, and cosmic order as interconnected. A successful kingdom reflected a properly ordered universe. The king occupied a central role within that system. Writing helped communicate and reinforce these ideas. The stela therefore functions on multiple levels: historical, political, religious, symbolic. Each layer contributes to its significance. The monument also highlights another important characteristic of Egyptian civilization: its confidence in permanence. The inscription was carved into stone, not written on a temporary surface, not intended for short-term use. The creators expected the monument to endure, and remarkably, it has. More than 3,000 years later, researchers can still study its text. This durability was not accidental. Ancient Egypt invested heavily in preservation: monuments, temples, inscriptions, papyrus archives. The civilization repeatedly sought ways to carry information into the future. The Victory Stela represents one expression of that broader ambition. Imagine the process behind its creation. Officials gathering information, scribes composing the text, artisans preparing the stone, skilled workers carving each hieroglyph carefully into the monument's surface. Every stage required effort, resources, coordination. Such investments make sense only if people believe the message matters. Clearly, the Egyptians did. The monument was not merely describing events, it was preserving significance. This emphasis on significance appears throughout Egyptian records. The civilization rarely treated writing as simple documentation. Writing carried cultural weight. It organized reality, structured memory, and transformed temporary experiences into enduring narratives. The Victory Stela demonstrates this principle particularly well. Conflict, by its nature, is chaotic. Campaigns involve uncertainty. Outcomes are never guaranteed. Yet the inscription imposes order upon those events. It arranges information into a coherent story, one that emphasizes stability, success, and continuity. This process mirrors something we have already seen repeatedly throughout Egyptian civilization. Again and again, writing serves as a tool for managing complexity. King lists organize history. Administrative records organize resources. Dream narratives organize legitimacy. Victory inscriptions organize memory. Different documents, different purposes, yet all reflect a common goal: the transformation of uncertainty into structure. The more researchers study Egyptian texts, the clearer this pattern becomes. Ancient Egypt was not simply recording the world. It was actively interpreting it, creating frameworks through which people could understand their experiences. And this effort extended far beyond politics and warfare. Some of the most surprising discoveries made possible by the decipherment of hieroglyphs concern a very different subject: the human body, illness, injury, and healing. Because hidden within surviving papyri are records that reveal an extraordinary intellectual achievement. Text showing that Egyptian scribes were not only documenting kings and monuments, they were documenting medical knowledge, observations, treatments, and practical experience gathered over generations, documents that provide a remarkable glimpse into how one of history's oldest civilizations attempted to understand the challenges of human health. And in doing so, they preserved some of the earliest medical literature ever created, the ancient medical records that surprised modern scientists. When most people imagine ancient Egypt, they think of monuments, towering pyramids rising from the desert, massive temples covered with hieroglyphs, golden treasures hidden within royal tombs. Few immediately think about medicine, yet some of the most remarkable texts unlocked by the decipherment of hieroglyphs had nothing to do with kings, wars, or monumental architecture. Instead, they focused on something much more personal: the human body, pain, injury, disease, and the challenge of helping people recover. These documents reveal a side of ancient Egypt that often receives less attention. A civilization not only interested in preserving history, but also committed to preserving knowledge gathered through observation, experience, and careful documentation. Among the most important examples are two famous texts known today as the Edwin Smith Papyrus and the Ebers Papyrus. Together, they offer a fascinating glimpse into how ancient Egyptians attempted to understand health and healing more than 3,000 years ago. For modern researchers, these documents were among the most surprising discoveries to emerge from the successful decoding of Egyptian writing, because they reveal a level of organization and intellectual curiosity that many people do not immediately associate with the ancient world. The story begins with an important question: how does a society preserve practical knowledge? Stories can be passed from one generation to the next through conversation. Traditions can survive through rituals and customs. But specialized knowledge presents a different challenge. A skilled builder knows techniques that others may not. A scribe possesses expertise developed through years of training. And a healer accumulates observations that could prove valuable long after a single patient's treatment has ended. If such information remains only in memory, it can easily disappear. Writing changes that. Writing allows knowledge to outlive individuals. The medical papyri demonstrate this principle beautifully. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is particularly fascinating because of its structure. Rather than presenting information in a purely mystical or symbolic form, the document often approaches injuries in a systematic manner, case by case, problem by problem, observation by observation. Researchers studying the text noticed something remarkable. The papyrus frequently follows a logical sequence. First, a condition is described. Then methods of examination are discussed. After that, possible treatments are presented. Finally, the prognosis is considered. In modern terms, the format feels surprisingly familiar. Not because ancient Egyptian medicine was identical to modern medicine. It certainly was not. But because the document demonstrates an effort to organize medical knowledge into a structured system. Imagine a healer treating a patient with a head injury. Instead of relying solely upon tradition or intuition, observations are recorded. Symptoms are noted. Patterns become recognizable. Future healers can consult those records. Knowledge accumulates. This process represents a significant intellectual achievement. The Edwin Smith Papyrus suggests that Egyptian practitioners understood the value of careful observation, and careful observation remains one of the foundations of scientific inquiry today. What makes the document especially interesting is its focus on trauma. Many cases involve physical injuries, wounds, fractures, damage resulting from accidents or other events. The text attempts to classify these conditions and determine appropriate responses. Modern readers sometimes find this surprising. Popular images of ancient medicine often emphasize mystery and ritual. The papyrus reveals another dimension: practical problem solving. Systematic documentation. Accumulated experience. The Ebers Papyrus provides a different perspective. It is significantly larger and covers a much broader range of subjects. The document contains hundreds of entries related to health, treatments, and medical practices. Its scope is impressive. The text addresses numerous conditions and reflects the complexity of Egyptian approaches to healing. Together, the two papyri reveal an important truth. Ancient Egyptian medicine was not a single unified system. It incorporated multiple forms of knowledge, observation, tradition, practical experience, religious beliefs. All existed within the broader framework of Egyptian society. Modern readers sometimes expect clear divisions between different categories of knowledge. Ancient cultures often operated differently. Medical practice could include practical treatments while also existing within a wider cultural and spiritual context. The presence of both elements should not be surprising. People throughout history have sought multiple ways to understand illness and recovery. The Egyptian texts reflect that reality. Yet regardless of specific treatments, the most important lesson may be the fact that the information was recorded at all. Writing transformed medical experience into a resource that could be shared. A healer's observations no longer ended with a single career. Knowledge became transferable, preservable, expandable. This ability to preserve information across generations contributed significantly to the stability of Egyptian civilization. The same pattern appears throughout the topics we have explored: history recorded, resources recorded, political narratives recorded. Now medical knowledge recorded. Again and again, Egypt relied upon documentation. The civilization trusted records. And for good reason, records allowed information to survive. Imagine two societies facing similar challenges. In one, knowledge exists primarily through oral transmission. In the other, knowledge is systematically documented. Both approaches have strengths. Yet written records provide certain advantages. They can be copied, reviewed, compared, expanded. Errors can be identified. Patterns become easier to recognize. The medical papyri demonstrate these benefits clearly. The texts preserved information that would otherwise have disappeared thousands of years ago, and because they survived, modern researchers can still study them today. Another fascinating aspect of these documents is what they reveal about Egyptian attitudes toward learning. The civilization invested considerable effort in training scribes. Literacy required dedication. Writing systems were complex. Materials were valuable. Education represented a significant commitment. Such investments make sense only if knowledge itself is considered important. The medical texts suggest precisely that. The Egyptians believed certain information deserved preservation, not because it was ceremonial, not because it was political, but because it was useful. This practical dimension often receives less attention than pyramids or royal monuments, yet it may be equally impressive. Great civilizations are not defined solely by spectacular buildings. They are also defined by their ability to organize and transmit knowledge. The medical papyri reveal a society actively engaged in that process, a society attempting to understand recurring problems and preserve effective responses. Researchers studying the texts have noted another important feature. The documents reflect accumulated experience rather than isolated observations. The information did not appear overnight, it developed over time, generation after generation, contributing to a growing body of knowledge. This continuity mirrors patterns seen elsewhere in Egyptian civilization. The kingdom excelled at preserving institutional memory. Temples preserve rituals. Administrative systems preserve records. Medical texts preserved expertise, different domains. Similar strategy: create continuity, reduce uncertainty, protect knowledge from being lost. The result was a civilization capable of maintaining remarkable stability across long periods of time. Of course, not every aspect of Egyptian medicine aligns with modern scientific understanding, nor should we expect it to. The goal is not to judge the past by contemporary standards. The goal is to understand how people approach problems using the tools and knowledge available to them. Viewed in that context, the medical papyri become deeply impressive. They reveal curiosity, organization, observation, and a commitment to documentation, qualities that help sustain one of history's most enduring civilizations. Most importantly, these texts remind us that hieroglyphs and papyri preserved far more than royal achievements. They preserved human experience, the experience of injury, recovery, concern, care, and learning. The writings allow ancient individuals to speak across millennia about challenges that remain familiar today. Yet as remarkable as these medical records are, they represent only one aspect of Egypt's relationship with memory. The civilization was equally concerned with another question, a question every society eventually confronts. How should history itself be remembered? Who deserves inclusion in the official story, and who does not? The answer can be found in a series of inscriptions that attempted something extraordinarily ambitious, nothing less than the creation of an official memory of Egypt's rulers. A memory carefully curated, organized, and sometimes selectively edited for future generations. The king lists that edited history. Every civilization tells stories about its past. Some stories are passed down through generations. Others are preserved in books, monuments, and official records. But whenever history is recorded, an important question emerges. Who gets remembered? At first, the answer may seem simple. Everyone. After all, if the purpose of historical records is to preserve information, why would anyone be excluded? Yet, history is rarely that straightforward. The people who create records make decisions. They choose which events deserve attention, which individuals should be celebrated, which achievements should be highlighted, and occasionally, which memories should fade. Ancient Egypt was no exception. In fact, some of the most fascinating discoveries made possible by the decipherment of hieroglyphs involve exactly this process. The process of constructing official memory, because among the countless inscriptions, monuments, and papyri left behind by Egyptian civilization are documents that attempted to organize not only time, but history itself. Two of the most important examples are known today as the Abydos King List and the Palermo Stone. Together, they reveal something remarkable. The Egyptians did not simply record their past, they carefully curated it. And in doing so, they left modern historians with valuable clues about how memory and power often work together. The story begins at Abydos. For thousands of years, Abydos was one of the most significant religious centers in Egypt. Pilgrims traveled there, temples were constructed there. Royal traditions became deeply connected to the site. Among its most famous monuments is the mortuary temple of Seti I. Inside this temple appears one of the most important historical records ever created in ancient Egypt, a carefully carved sequence of royal names known as the Abydos King List. At first glance, the inscription seems straightforward: rows of pharaohs, one ruler after another, a chronological sequence stretching across centuries. To modern historians, such a list is enormously valuable. It provides evidence about dynasties, succession, political continuity, historical chronology. Yet when researchers began studying the inscription more closely, they noticed something unusual. Some rulers were missing, not accidentally missing, deliberately absent. This realization transformed the way scholars viewed the document. The list was not merely preserving history, it was presenting a particular version of history. To understand why this matters, imagine creating a timeline of national leaders while intentionally omitting certain figures. The resulting list would still contain valuable information, but it would no longer be a complete record. Instead, it would reflect specific choices, specific priorities, specific ideas about who deserved inclusion. The Abydos king list appears to operate in much the same way. Certain rulers are prominently displayed, others are absent. The omissions themselves became important historical evidence. Modern researchers began asking new questions. Why were particular names excluded? What message was the list attempting to communicate? The answers reveal much about Egyptian attitudes toward legitimacy and continuity. For Egyptians, kingship represented more than political authority. It embodied order, stability, and the proper functioning of society. The king served as a guardian of Ma'at, the principle of balance and harmony that played such a central role in Egyptian thought. As a result, royal history carried enormous symbolic significance. A king list was not simply a collection of names. It was a statement about continuity, a demonstration that legitimate authority stretched backward through generations. Viewed from this perspective, the Abydos king list becomes easier to understand. The goal was not necessarily to produce a modern-style historical database. The goal was to present a lineage, a sequence of rulers connected through legitimacy and tradition. This distinction is important because it helps explain why certain figures received different treatment. The list reflects cultural values as much as historical facts, and that makes it extraordinarily revealing. The document tells us not only about kings, but also about the people who created the record, their priorities, their assumptions, and their understanding of the past. This relationship between history and interpretation appears throughout human civilization. Modern societies do something similar. Textbooks emphasize certain events, museums highlight particular achievements, national holidays commemorate specific moments. Every culture creates narratives about its history. Ancient Egypt was no different. The difference is that many of its narratives survived in stone. The Palermo stone offers another fascinating example. Unlike the Abydos king list, it preserves information in a different format. The artifact contains records associated with early Egyptian rulers and important events from their reigns. Although only fragments survive today, the stone remains one of the most significant sources for understanding Egypt's earliest dynasties. Researchers studying the Palermo stone quickly recognized its importance. The inscription records details that extend beyond simple lists of names. It attempts to organize historical information systematically: events, ceremonies, administrative activities, royal achievements. The stone reflects an extraordinary effort to document the development of the kingdom over time. Once again, we encounter a familiar theme: ancient Egypt's desire to transform complexity into structure. The civilization repeatedly sought ways to organize information. Administrative records organized resources, medical papyri organized knowledge, king lists organized chronology, the Palermo stone organized historical memory. Different subjects, the same underlying principle: create order, preserve continuity, reduce uncertainty. This consistency is one of the most striking features of Egyptian civilization. The commitment to documentation appears everywhere. Again and again, people invested resources into preserving information for future generations. The result is one of the richest historical archives from the ancient world. Yet these records also remind us that memory is never entirely neutral. Even the most carefully organized history reflects human decisions, choices about what matters, choices about what deserves preservation, choices about what future generations should know. The Abydos king list illustrates this clearly. Its omissions are just as informative as its inclusions. Sometimes absence tells its own story. Sometimes what is missing becomes historically significant. This observation encourages historians to approach ancient texts thoughtfully, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. The goal is not simply to read the information. The goal is to understand the context in which it was created. Who produced it? Why? For whom? These questions transform documents from passive records into active historical evidence, and they often reveal insights far beyond the original text itself. The king lists also highlight something deeply human: the desire to belong to a larger story. Egyptian rulers wanted their reigns connected to those who came before. They wanted continuity, legitimacy, a place within the unfolding narrative of civilization. That desire remains familiar today. People continue constructing family histories, national histories, institutional histories. We organize the past because it helps us understand the present. Ancient Egypt pursued the same goal. Its methods were different. Its tools were different. But the underlying impulse was remarkably similar. The decipherment of hieroglyphs allowed modern researchers to recognize this more clearly than ever before. The texts revealed a civilization deeply concerned with memory, not simply preserving it, managing it, organizing it, and sometimes shaping it. Yet official records were only one side of Egyptian writing. Alongside administrative documents and royal inscriptions existed another category of text entirely: stories, narratives, works of literature, texts that explored identity, uncertainty, belonging, and human experience. Because while kings recorded victories and scribes documented resources, Egyptian writers were also creating something surprisingly familiar: literature. And among the most remarkable literary works ever recovered from ancient Egypt is the story of a man whose life changed in a single moment. A man who left home, wandered far from everything he knew, and spent years searching for a place where he truly belonged. The ancient story that still feels human today. When people hear the phrase ancient Egyptian writing, they often imagine official records, royal decrees, temple inscriptions, administrative documents, lists of kings and inventories of resources. And certainly those texts formed an important part of Egyptian civilization. But once scholars successfully deciphered hieroglyphs, they discovered something unexpected. The Egyptians were not only recording governments and monuments, they were telling stories. Stories about fear, identity, belonging, loss, success, and the complicated emotions that come with being human. These literary works open an entirely different window into the ancient world. They allowed modern readers to encounter Egypt not only as a civilization of pharaohs and temples, but as a society filled with individuals facing challenges that still feel familiar today. Among the most remarkable examples is a work known as the Story of Sinuhe. For historians, it is one of the greatest surviving pieces of ancient Egyptian literature, not because it contains dramatic battles or spectacular miracles, but because it explores something deeply human: the search for home. The story begins with a moment of uncertainty. Sinuhe, an official connected to the royal court, suddenly finds himself caught in a situation that changes the course of his life. News spreads regarding the death of a king. Political conditions become unclear. Confusion emerges. And in the midst of that uncertainty, Sinuhe makes a decision. He leaves Egypt. The details of why he departs have fascinated scholars for generations. Different interpretations exist, but what matters most for the narrative is what follows: a journey away from everything familiar. As the story unfolds, Sinuhe travels beyond Egypt's borders. He enters foreign lands, encounters unfamiliar cultures, builds a new life, and achieves success in ways he never expected. On the surface, it sounds like an adventure, yet beneath that adventure lies a deeper theme: the tension between opportunity and belonging. Sinuhe prospers. He gains status. He earns respect. Yet throughout the story, Egypt remains present in his thoughts. His homeland continues to shape his identity. This emotional connection gives the narrative much of its power. Because despite the centuries separating modern audiences from ancient Egypt, the underlying experience remains recognizable. People move, migrate, build lives far from where they began, adapt to new environments, and often wrestle with questions about where they truly belong. The story of Sinuhe explores those questions with remarkable sophistication. This is one reason historians value the text so highly. It demonstrates that Egyptian literature was capable of addressing complex emotional themes. The civilization did not simply preserve facts, it preserved reflections on human experience. And those reflections reveal a great deal about Egyptian society. The story presents Egypt as a place of order and cultural identity, not through direct political argument, but through the emotional journey of its main character. Sinuhe's experiences abroad help define what Egypt represents: home, stability, familiarity, continuity. The narrative therefore operates on multiple levels. It is a personal story, a cultural reflection, and a literary exploration of identity, all at the same time. The very existence of such a text tells us something important. Literature mattered in ancient Egypt. Stories mattered. The civilization invested resources in preserving them, copying them, teaching them, passing them from one generation to the next. That effort required skilled scribes, training, materials, time. No society makes such investments unless it believes stories possess value. Clearly, the Egyptians did, and the story of Sinuhe was not the only example. Another famous text reveals a different side of Egyptian thought, a work known as the Inscriptions of Ptahhotep. Unlike Sinuhe, this text is not primarily a narrative. Instead, it belongs to a tradition often described as wisdom literature. The purpose is guidance, advice, reflection, practical philosophy. The text presents recommendations for how individuals should conduct themselves, how they should interact with others, how they should navigate social life responsibly. At first glance, such material might seem distant from modern concerns. Yet many readers are surprised by how familiar some of its themes feel. Patience, humility, listening carefully, treating others with respect, avoiding arrogance. These ideas appear repeatedly throughout the work. The text reflects a society deeply interested in ethical behavior. And once again, writing serves as the mechanism through which that knowledge is preserved. This pattern should sound familiar by now. Ancient Egypt repeatedly transformed experience into documentation. Administrative experience became records. Medical experience became papyri. Historical experience became king lists. And ethical experience became literature. The civilization displayed extraordinary confidence in the power of written knowledge. The instructions of Ptahhotep illustrate this confidence beautifully. The text assumes wisdom can be transmitted, that lessons learned by one generation can benefit another. That experience becomes more valuable when preserved. These assumptions help sustain Egyptian civilization across long periods of time. Knowledge did not need to begin from zero with every generation. Information could accumulate, expand, and endure. The same principle appears throughout the literary tradition. Stories preserved cultural values. Wisdom texts preserved social guidance. Together they helped create continuity, a shared framework through which people understood themselves and their world. Modern readers sometimes focus primarily on Egypt's monuments. Yet these texts remind us that civilizations are built from ideas as much as stone. Pyramids are impressive. So are philosophies. Temples endure. So do stories. The decipherment of hieroglyphs allowed researchers to recover both, and in many ways the literary works feel especially intimate. Monuments tell us what civilizations built. Stories tell us what people cared about. The story of Sinuhe reveals concern with identity and belonging. The instructions of Ptahhotep reveal concern with behavior and responsibility. Together, they demonstrate a society engaged in thoughtful reflection about human life. This observation challenges many common assumptions about the ancient world. Ancient societies are sometimes portrayed as fundamentally different from modern ones, separated by immense cultural distance. And certainly important differences existed. Yet the literature reveals familiar concerns. How should people behave? How should they treat one another? What does it mean to belong somewhere? How should individuals respond to uncertainty? These questions remain relevant today. The texts survived because generations of scribes preserved them, copied them, studied them, valued them. Without that effort, the works might have disappeared forever. Instead, they became part of one of history's most remarkable archives. An archive capable of speaking across thousands of years. Perhaps this is the most extraordinary result of deciphering hieroglyphs, not merely recovering facts, but recovering voices. Voices discussing experiences that remain recognizable despite the passage of time. Yet even as Egyptian literature explored identity and ethics, another challenge continued shaping life along the Nile. A challenge no civilization could fully control: nature itself. The annual flooding of the Nile supported Egyptian prosperity, but environmental conditions could also create uncertainty. Harvests could vary, resources could become strained, communities could face hardship, and when such challenges emerged, Egyptians once again turned to writing, not only to document events, but to make sense of them, to explain them, and to preserve lessons that future generations might need. Some of the most fascinating texts ever recovered from ancient Egypt emerged from exactly these circumstances. Story and inscriptions that reveal how a civilization responded when stability itself seemed, when ancient Egypt faced crisis. For most of its long history, ancient Egypt projected an image of stability. The Nile flowed through the landscape. Harvests sustained communities. Temples performed rituals. Kings governed the kingdom. And scribes carefully recorded the systems that kept society functioning. This image of order appears throughout Egyptian monuments and inscriptions. Again and again, texts celebrate continuity, balance, prosperity, and the successful maintenance of Ma'at, the principle of harmony that lay at the heart of Egyptian thought. Yet beneath this confidence was a reality every civilization eventually confronts: uncertainty. No society can completely control nature. No government can eliminate every challenge. No community is immune to hardship. The Egyptians understood this, and because they understood it, they developed ways of thinking about crisis, ways of explaining it, ways of preserving lessons from difficult experiences. Some of the most fascinating texts unlocked through the decipherment of hieroglyphs reveal exactly how they approached these moments of uncertainty. Two examples stand out in particular: the famine stela and the tale of the shipwrecked sailor. At first glance, these texts seem very different. One focuses on environmental hardship. The other tells a dramatic narrative of survival. Yet both explore a common theme: how people respond when the world becomes unpredictable. The story begins with one of the most fundamental concerns any society can face: food. Modern populations often rely on extensive transportation networks and global supply chains. Ancient Egypt depended heavily on the Nile. Its annual floods deposited fertile soil across agricultural lands. This process supported harvests and helped sustain one of history's most successful civilizations. For generations, Egyptians observed the rhythms of the river. The flood arrived. Fields were nourished. Crops were planted. Life continued. But what happened when conditions changed? What happened when expectations were disrupted? The famine stela addresses exactly this kind of question. The inscription, carved onto stone many centuries after the rain it describes, tells a story involving a prolonged period of poor harvests. According to the narrative, years of difficulty created widespread concern. Agricultural production suffered, resources became strained, the kingdom faced uncertainty. For modern historians, the text is valuable not simply because of the events it describes. It is valuable because of how those events are interpreted. The inscription attempts to create meaning, to transform hardship into narrative, to explain uncertainty within a broader framework people could understand. This pattern should sound familiar. Throughout Egyptian civilization, writing repeatedly served as a tool for organizing reality. History became king lists, medical experience became papyri, political authority became inscriptions, and now, environmental uncertainty became narrative. The goal remained remarkably consistent: create structure, preserve understanding, reduce confusion. The famine stela demonstrates this process clearly. Rather than presenting a random sequence of difficulties, the text organizes events into a coherent story. People could read it, reflect upon it, and draw lessons from it. Whether discussing prosperity or hardship, Egyptian writing continually sought to impose order upon experience. This strategy was not unique to Egypt. Human beings everywhere create stories to make sense of uncertainty. What makes Egypt unusual is how extensively those stories were preserved. The civilization invested extraordinary effort in documentation. As a result, modern researchers can still examine how Egyptians thought about challenges more than 3,000 years later. The tale of the shipwrecked sailor offers a different perspective on uncertainty. Unlike the famine stela, it is primarily a literary work, yet it explores many of the same themes. The story follows an individual who survives a disastrous voyage, separated from familiar surroundings, facing an unknown environment, forced to adapt to circumstances beyond his control. The narrative contains dramatic elements: adventure, isolation, unexpected encounters. Yet beneath these details lies something deeper: the experience of confronting uncertainty. Imagine standing far from home with no clear idea of what comes next. The future becomes difficult to predict. Normal assumptions no longer apply. Every decision carries additional weight. These emotions remain recognizable today, and they likely felt just as real to ancient audiences. The tale transforms those feelings into narrative form. In doing so, it provides insight into Egyptian attitudes toward resilience. The protagonist faces challenges, but he also demonstrates adaptability, patience, and persistence. These qualities allow him to survive. The story therefore functions on multiple levels. It entertains, it teaches, and it reflects cultural values. Much like the story of Sinuhe, it uses narrative to explore human experience. The difference is that uncertainty itself occupies center stage. What makes the tale particularly interesting is how it balances danger with hope. The protagonist encounters difficulties, yet the narrative never becomes entirely pessimistic. Possibilities remain. Solutions emerge. The future remains open. This balance reflects a broader characteristic of Egyptian thought. The civilization certainly recognized hardship. Its texts acknowledge uncertainty repeatedly. Yet many narratives also emphasize continuity, recovery, and renewal. The annual Nile flood itself may have reinforced this perspective. Every year brought change. Every year brought uncertainty. Yet the cycle continued. Life adapted. Communities endured. This rhythm influenced Egyptian culture profoundly. Researchers often note how strongly Egyptian civilization emphasized stability. But stability did not mean the absence of challenges. Rather, it meant developing systems capable of responding to challenges. Writing formed part of that response. Records preserved knowledge. Stories preserved lessons. Inscriptions preserved memory. Each helped future generations navigate uncertainty more effectively. The famine stela and the tale of the shipwrecked sailor demonstrate this principle beautifully. Different texts, different genres, the same underlying purpose. Transform difficult experiences into usable knowledge. This ability to learn from experience may be one of the civilization's most impressive achievements. Ancient Egypt lasted for thousands of years. Such longevity rarely happens by accident. Successful societies develop mechanisms for preserving what they learn. The Egyptians excelled at this. They documented observations, recorded traditions, preserved narratives, and created archives that extended across generations. The result was a civilization with an extraordinary capacity for continuity. Even crises became part of the historical record, not hidden, not forgotten, but organized into forms future generations could understand. The decipherment of hieroglyphs revealed this process with remarkable clarity. Modern readers can now see how Egyptians confronted uncertainty, not through silence, but through documentation, through storytelling, through preservation. And perhaps that is one of the most important lessons these texts offer. Human beings cannot eliminate uncertainty, but they can respond to it. They can respond to it. They can record experiences, share knowledge, and create systems that help future generations face similar challenges. Ancient Egypt did exactly that. Its writings transformed hardship into memory, memory into understanding, and understanding into continuity. Yet after exploring records of kings, medical knowledge, literature, and resilience, a larger picture begins to emerge. A picture connecting all of these texts together. Because the true significance of deciphering hieroglyphs extends far beyond any single inscription or papyrus. What researchers ultimately uncovered was something much larger, a civilization-wide effort to preserve knowledge itself. an effort that allowed ancient voices to survive across millennia and speak once again in the modern world. What scientists really discovered when they decoded the hieroglyphs. When the Rosetta Stone was first deciphered, many people imagined that scholars were unlocking a series of ancient secrets. In a sense, they were, but the reality turned out to be far more interesting than most expected. Researchers did not uncover a single hidden message. They did not discover one dramatic revelation that changed everything overnight. Instead, they recovered something much larger, an entire system of thought, a civilization's method for organizing reality. And that may be the most surprising discovery of all, because as historians gradually translated inscriptions, papyri, monuments, and literary works, a remarkable pattern began to emerge. The Egyptians were not simply recording events. They were building structures of knowledge, structures designed to survive long after individual people, rulers, and even dynasties had disappeared. Over the course of this journey, we have encountered many different kinds of texts: the Rosetta Stone, the Turin Royal Canon, the Dream Stela, the Great Harris Papyrus, the Victory Stela of Merneptah, medical papyri, king lists, literary works, narratives about resilience. At first glance, these sources seem unrelated. One discusses kings, these sources seem unrelated. One discusses kings, another discusses medicine, another explores literature, another records resources. Yet when viewed together, they reveal a common purpose: the preservation of order. Again and again, ancient Egypt transformed complexity into structure. That transformation appears everywhere. A kingdom generates thousands of years of rulers. The king lists organize them. A society accumulates medical observations. The papyri preserve them. Political authority requires legitimacy. Monuments explain it. People struggle with identity and belonging. Literature explores it. Environmental uncertainty creates anxiety. Stories help make sense of it. Different challenges, the same solution: documentation. Writing became one of the most powerful tools ever developed by Egyptian civilization. It allowed knowledge to move beyond individual lifetimes. This achievement can be easy to overlook because modern societies are surrounded by information. Books, databases, libraries, digital archives. We often take preservation for granted. Ancient Egypt could not. Every document required labor, materials, training, skill. The act of recording information represented a significant investment, yet the Egyptians made that investment repeatedly, for thousands of years, and because they did, their civilization remains one of the best documented in the ancient world. The decipherment of hieroglyphs allowed researchers to recognize this more clearly than ever before. Before the breakthrough, monuments appeared impressive but silent. Their surfaces were covered with symbols whose meanings remained inaccessible. People could admire the architecture. They could study the art. The voices behind the monuments remained distant. The Rosetta Stone changed that. Gradually, inscriptions began speaking again. Not literally, of course, but intellectually. The text revealed intentions, ideas, beliefs, questions, concerns, and aspirations. The ancient Egyptians emerged not merely as builders of monuments, but as thinkers, administrators, writers, observers, storytellers. And perhaps that is the most important shift produced by decipherment. The civilization became more human. The pyramids are extraordinary, but they do not tell us how a physician approached an injury. A king list does. The temples are magnificent, but they do not reveal how someone felt living far from home. The story into Sinuhe does. The monuments inspire awe, but they do not explain how people reflected upon uncertainty. The tale of the shipwrecked sailor does. Writing filled those gaps. It preserved dimensions of life that stone alone could never capture. Another fascinating discovery involves the sophistication of Egyptian information systems. Many people imagine ancient civilizations as relatively simple. The evidence tells a different story. The documents reveal complex administrative networks, detailed resource management, long-term historical record-keeping, specialized professions, educational traditions, and sophisticated methods for preserving institutional knowledge. These systems helped sustain Egypt across extraordinary spans of time. Civilizations rise and fall for many reasons, but continuity often depends upon information. Knowledge must survive. Skills must be transmitted. Experience must be preserved. The Egyptians understood this deeply. Their writing systems became tools for achieving exactly that goal. The result was a civilization capable of maintaining remarkable stability across centuries, not because challenges never occurred, but because knowledge could be carried forward. Every generation inherited records from those who came before. This continuity created resilience, and resilience created longevity. Perhaps the most surprising lesson, however, concerns the purpose of writing itself. Many modern readers initially assume ancient inscriptions existed primarily to describe reality. Yet Egyptian texts often did something more. They organized reality. They created frameworks through which people understood the world. A king list did not merely preserve names. It created historical continuity. A medical text did not merely record treatments. It organized expertise. A literary narrative did not merely entertain. It explored cultural values. A monument did not merely commemorate events. It shaped memory. Writing became a way of managing complexity. And complexity is something every civilization faces. The Egyptians responded by documenting, classifying, preserving, and transmitting knowledge. This strategy proved remarkably successful. 3,000 years later, their records continue informing modern research. That fact alone is extraordinary. Consider the distance involved. Empires rose and fell. Languages evolved. Religions changed. Technologies transformed the world. Yet ancient Egyptian texts survived. Not all of them. Certainly not perfectly. But enough survived to allow meaningful conversation across millennia. Very few civilizations have achieved something similar on such a scale. The Rosetta Stone often receives credit for unlocking hieroglyphs, and rightly so. Without it, many texts might still remain inaccessible. But perhaps the stone's greatest achievement was not decipherment itself. It was restoration. The restoration of communication. For centuries, the inscriptions had been silent. Then suddenly they became understandable again. The result was not one discovery. It was thousands of discoveries. Each translated text added another piece to the puzzle, another voice, another perspective, another glimpse into one of history's most influential civilizations. And those voices continue speaking today. Not because ancient Egypt was mysterious, not because it possessed secret knowledge hidden from the world, but because it cared deeply about preservation. The civilization believed experiences should be recorded, knowledge should be protected, history should be remembered, stories should endure. That commitment transformed papyrus and stone into repositories of memory. The hieroglyphs were never intended to be mysteries. They were intended to communicate. And after centuries of silence, they finally succeeded once again. Perhaps that is the most remarkable part of the story. 3,000 years ago, a scribe carefully carved symbols into stone or brushed ink onto papyrus. He could not possibly have imagined modern archaeologists studying those words thousands of years later. Yet through an extraordinary chain of preservation, discovery, and decipherment, the message survived. The symbols remained, the language returned, and the voices of ancient Egypt found their audience once again, not hidden, not forgotten, but preserved exactly as their creators had hoped, waiting patiently for someone to learn how to read them.